and welcome back to the Immigration Ain't Easy podcast. I am honored to be joined today by Dr. Austin Kocher. Um, Dr. Kocher, or as I refer to you as Austin, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
Um, He's a geographer and an assistant research professor in the Office of Research and Creative Activity in the SI Newhouse of Public Communication at Syracuse University. Go Orange. That is my alma mater. So thank
Awesome.
you for repping Syracuse. Um, he previously worked at the Civic Research Data Lab, CRDL, and the Transactional Records Access Clearinghouse, TRAC, a research lab at Syracuse University that uses FOIA requests to study the U.S. immigration enforcement apparatus. Uh, Dr. Kocher graduated from the Ohio State University. I learned that you have to really emphasize the from watching football.
They made
He
it legal
graduated.
now too.
It did.
So,
And he has a PhD in geography, which I really find fascinating with, kind of the juxtaposition to what you do in your professional life. So we'll get a little bit into that. Um, and I can go on and on about you, but I do want to say I think what draws lawyers like myself and others in the immigration world to you is the fact that you do some critical research that really impacts on a widespread basis how we make sometimes decisions on and sometimes difficult decisions or advising people on their immigration paths, especially when it comes to immigration court. And the work you have done with TRAC has been so critical. I highly recommend anyone to go online and look up TRAC, TRAC. You can just search that in Syracuse and it would come right up. And you can find all the back data on immigration judges across the United States. And a lot of the data that has been compiled through Austin's research has also been cited to in a multitude of publications. One that sticks out to me, I think, quite considerably is the backlog of cases that we see in immigration court, and that data ends up all over the place when people start to see the mind-boggling numbers that are coming out of our immigration courts and how backlogged they are getting and how bad they'll probably keep getting under the Trump administration. So anyways, enough about you. Let's talk a little bit more about you, Austin. So let me just kick this off with asking you, and I think this is one of the more interesting aspects. How did you get go from being a PhD holder in geography to becoming more of a recognized expert on immigration controls and policing and enforcement?
yeah, so the story sort of starts before my PhD. So my pathway into college was first by doing 4 years in the service. So I was in the Navy for 4 years, and while I was in, I did base security. I was basically a cop. I did some sort of routine base security stuff for a couple months, and then I got selected to do a waterborne security unit. So I was driving boats in the Navy. I mean, this was years ago, obviously, um, and that's what I did for a couple years. I was in Puerto Rico at the time. That's relevant because when it came time to coming back to Ohio, where I grew up and going to school, and looking at what would be a fun and interesting career path. I never imagined that I'd become a professor, that I'd get a PhD. I was just sort of happy to be able to go to college. But I ended up stumbling into a geography program at Ohio State University, which was a fantastic geography department. And it was around the time that 287G and secure communities was rolling out as a policy. And for those of you who might be a little bit newer to immigration, this was the late 2000s. This was Bush and Obama transition period when immigration policing was sort of all of a sudden moving away from the border as a traditional site of enforcement to sort of feeling like it was everywhere. So those two things sort of merged, and I thought, well, gosh, this is something I'm getting more interested in. I had enough of a background in law enforcement that, and being in the military, that I sort of understood institutions. I sort of understood a bit about how police and policing worked, I didn't necessarily grow up in a very political family or anything like that, but it was around this time that I was sort of, this is during the war on terror and the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I was really coming out of the military, like a lot of young folks at the time, going, man, I'm not really sure that this is a really great use of resources. And, and sort of coming out, rethinking, I think, the role of the US military in the world, and wanting to take that experience and not lose it, but to do something maybe a little bit different with it. So that's how I ended up studying immigration. And my focus, because I had a little bit of a quantitative background, was always both very ethnographic and qualitative, and also very quantitative. So my master's degree and my dissertation was really focused on those policies, really focused on immigration enforcement. So by the time I graduated with my PhD in 2017, and was looking at how I take all of this work and turn it into some research as a career. Track had a position opened up at Syracuse University, and they brought me on. I think they were interested in the fact that I had used FOIA, I'd used public records requests before in my research, and so I was already familiar with that process. But also that I had spent years interviewing law enforcement, sitting in immigration courtrooms across the country. I'd spent time along the border. I had started and ran a small nonprofit organization, a worker center in Columbus, Ohio, that did direct advocacy for immigrant families facing deportation. So I'd sort of seen different sides of the immigration system already, sort of in the real world, so to speak. So by the time, Track was interested in filling a position, I think that they sort of saw me as someone who had the quantitative skills and the public record skills, but could also, when you get data back from the government like that, it's not just number crunching. It's not like you just throw it in some sort of like statistical software that spits out some answers. You really have to understand how these systems work in reality. So I guess to make a long story short, I think the thing that sort of ties together my career and my life story as it relates to this work is I just have a real passion and real interest for understanding how systems work, or in the case of immigration, how they don't
Yeah.
work.
So let me ask you,
Yeah.
before you got to Track, what year was that? Was that in 2019 or?
Yeah, so that was 2019 I started
Okay.
at Track. Yeah.
Prior to getting over to Track, how many individuals were working in that lab, so to speak, and what was their methodology, and did it change at all once you came in and brought in some of your skill set?
Yeah, so they were really small. When I got there was only 3 people on staff. It's a
Wow.
very small place. I mean, it punches way above its weight in terms of impact given its size, and it's never really been more, since I was there, more than 6 people who are full time. So it's not very big, but you develop a lot of institutional knowledge over the years. So you can sort of, when you're working with data like that, you can kind of build in programs that, just because you get a giant data set from the government, it doesn't mean that you are necessarily going in and treating it like you're studying it from scratch. You get really used to what's there, and you can kind of build systems to clean it up and validate it. So it saves you a lot of time. I think that methodology didn't always change that much, because a lot of it's based on historical built up knowledge. I think the part that I probably contributed the most was as a geographer. I really helped us to think more critically about spatializing and visualizing and mapping the data that we had. I also think that because I had a much stronger background in immigration, I brought much more of I think a more substantive analytical view to the data itself. So I think, the feedback that I've gotten, we don't really put our names on those reports. They're institutional reports, sort of like, The Economist or something. But the feedback that I got from colleagues and reporters was they would they would say that they would be able to tell that I maybe worked on a report because there just seemed to be more texture, real world texture
Yeah.
to it as opposed to just numbers.
Where did you get your master's degree, and what was your master's in?
Ohio State, and it was also geography.
Geography. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm a
Um,
geographer through and through.
Now, when you talk about 287G and the policing and enforcement of immigration and the uprising of that, also we started to see in different municipalities and states, like with Hazleton, Pennsylvania, and then SB 1070 in Arizona and Georgia, started to see a spread of that. Attrition through enforcement mentality that was coming out of the likes of Chris Kobach and FAIR and those more nativist, restrictionist organizations. Um, and so I think it looks like your story kind of parallels with that, pun intended, track of this enforcement mindset that we started to see in the like maybe 2005 to 2010 timeframe, and then as it continued to grow. Um, Prior to getting, pretty involved in the immigration work that you started to do, did you have a personal connection to your own like family's history, and or is there anything that really inside of you, really like kind of sparked from everything that was going on? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's a good question because I'm not an immigrant myself. I'm not a person of color. I don't live in the world in the same way that a lot of immigrants do. So that has never been my connection. My connection was really, and my exposure, I suppose, is twofold. One, living in Puerto Rico for several years, being delightfully exposed to that culture. That at a young age, it was just sort of normalized for me. I was, and I got out of the military. I stayed in Puerto Rico, so I lived. It's not like I was always in the military while I was there. I was there doing other things too, and really liked it. So I guess that was normalized as a young adult. I guess I would say, but I would say even before that, my dad's in construction.
Yeah.
He's just a working class
Blue
guy.
collar.
Yep, very blue collar family. And I guess the part of my family story that intersects the most and that still connects the most for me is just that like working people, blue collar people everywhere, immigrant, non-immigrant, white, brown, black, we have a connection. We have a shared understanding of the world, not because our experiences are identical, but to put food on the table for your family, to work a hard day's work, and to know what it's like to not always be able to make ends meet. That's something I just grew up with, just like deep in my soul. I didn't even realize you could live differently than that. So when the question about immigration and deportation came over, as I started to get exposed to that, I guess my gut reaction from the very beginning was like, I mean, these are working people. What's the problem? And so that connection, that class connection, has always been much stronger to me, as opposed to like a personal immigration connection.
Yeah, and
It
I
still
think
is.
yeah, I think a lot of people who get, entrenched in the work that you or I do, you start to see the human aspect of it. So like even though you deal with a lot of just numbers and data and, very, I'd say method based research, and I deal with, people and humans, we can actually connect those things and it makes a big difference. I mean, you know, one story I like to tell people, especially when it relates to the data on the track website. I was asked, I worked on a case, I think you may know her, Ava Banash,
Oh yeah.
the lawyer.
Yep. Yep.
So Ava had been on the border for a little while doing some research or doing some work helping trans migrants that were coming up, transgender migrants coming up from Central America. And one of the cases wound up in Phoenix and wound up with this judge. the judge had based off of the data, uh, about 3% grant rate for asylum cases.
Mm-hmm.
And so I saw that and I cringed. I was like, oh, this is not good. And in immigration court, you don't pick the judges. The court picks, the judges for you. Most people are unrepresented and don't have a lawyer to represent them. And so it does sometimes help, but doesn't always, depending on the judge, obviously. And I asked around and said, hey, I don't know this judge. And they said, nice guy, but he will deny the case, prepare for an appeal. So make sure you have your record prepared. But I will tell you that that case, he granted it. And it was quite astounding. And it really bucked the trend there. But again, it did give me some advance notice where, on the other hand, there's a judge out of, I think San Francisco has like a 99 or 98% grant rate for asylum cases. So, at least when you're going in, you're not going in totally blind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one of the more useful parts and one of the more powerful examples of the way that data can be really useful for attorneys, for everyone. I'll actually give you a little bit of behind the scenes look at what all that, what putting those reports together looks like, Mo.
Sure.
So, years ago, and this is before I was there, of course, but, years ago when tracks started, well, actually, even before that. So the data that Track gets for the immigration courts that allows us, to turn that into the reports and the tools that you're talking about to see asylum grant rates, denial rates, and all of that. That's through Freedom of Information Act requests, through FOIA requests. Uniquely, it was not through a lawsuit. So typically, if you want to get data from the Department of Homeland Security about immigration stuff, basically everybody agrees if you want to get something, you basically have to litigate. You have to sue. The agency is really slow. They slow walk things sometimes on purpose. It seems like they are recalcitrant when it comes to even reasonable requests for transparency. Very difficult agency to work with. Not always because of the FOIA officers there. There's very good FOIA officers there, but it's the agency has its culture, and ICE in particular has its own difficult culture. The Department of Justice is a little bit different. They're a little bit more open to conversation, or at least have been traditionally. So that data set, it's through FOIA, but it didn't require litigation, thankfully. As a result of that, that data set is really big and it's really thorough. And it's very interconnected. So you can do a lot with this data set. One of the things it allows you to do is to identify the judges that make decisions in cases. And then you can do the math, you can do the analysis and figure out what their grant denial rate is. When Track first started doing that, highly controversial. There's been this historic sort of disposition among the courts and judges in the United States, including federal district circuit judges, that they don't really want the public seeing behind the curtain at all.
When did Track come around? What year was that?
Well, Track was formed up in 89, 1990.
Oh, so it's been around for like
been around for a long
35 years almost. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
But the immigration court data is maybe at this point 20 years old, 15, 20 years old.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And so very controversial. Now, fast forward to today, judges are very interested in the data. The Immigration Judges Union likes the fact, actually, that there's data out there. And it's not because they always interpret their own disposition through the data. Oh, I'm a good judge, I'm a bad judge. But, I've talked to judges who they say, look, I sit in this courthouse 50 hours a week. I have no idea what my colleagues are doing. The agency doesn't give us any information. I don't know what this guy's doing, what this lady's doing. They don't know. So and even the ICE attorneys, the OPLA attorneys, Office of Principal Legal
Advisors,
yeah. Right? The quote unquote prosecutors in the courtroom, they don't know, what judges are doing either. So Track has become not just a resource actually for folks like yourself who are representing clients, but for lots and lots and lots of people. And so it's where it started out very controversial, it's become normalized. And really, that's what we want when it comes to public transparency. We want transparency to become normalized in a way that the public recognizes that this is actually, and the government agencies and actors themselves understand this is useful for everyone, not just immigrants and attorneys. Although it's
Can
definitely.
you maybe take a quick chronological walkthrough of what a FOIA request looks like how long does it take for you to get this like data dump that comes or the documents that come?
Yeah, so we at Track we really focused on, and then my research is always really focused on data. So we're from beginning to end. You're probably looking at 2 to 10 years, because especially if you have to litigate. So if you do end up going to litigation, those cases just last a long time. And the beginning, what I would say is too, is a lot of people don't necessarily understand what the beginning of a FOIA request looks like. The beginning of a FOIA request really isn't when you send a FOIA request in. The beginning of a FOIA request, at least from a researcher's perspective, is when you start investigating a question and when you start thinking to yourself and you're doing the preliminary research to say, okay, I want to ask this question, but I have to understand how the government might possibly be storing the data that I want to access. So a bad FOIA request is, you write an email, you submit it to a FOIA email Dropbox that says, how many people are, how many pending cases are there right now in the courts? Well, that's a terrible FOIA request, right? Because the government, it's not as if that data point is lying around
Yeah,
on a document somewhere.
it's a moving target.
It's a moving target. And it depends on who's doing the analysis. It depends on what you mean by pending. It depends on all kinds of factors. And because it's a moving target, it is going to change over time. So you might get that answer, but you might submit that now. But if you don't get that back for 2 to 5 years, that data point's irrelevant by the time they respond, right? So
Yeah.
the way to do to wait the way that researchers write FOIA requests is we say, okay, what is the universe of data that an agency has, and how can I request? How can I get the underlying data in a way that I can get that data, I can validate it and trust it, and then I can do the analysis myself because I don't trust the agency to do the analysis for me, not because they are necessarily trying to be untransparent. Maybe they are, not necessarily because they're incompetent, although maybe they aren't competent to do what I'm asking. But I want to get the underlying data so I can, so I understand it and I can trust the result.
So when, like, for example, I think maybe it was December or so of 2022, you had come to the border and I met you out here in
Yeah.
Arizona. Shortly after your visit here, if I'm not mistaken, I think you had come out with a press release or a report that said that the total number of cases in the backlog in the immigration court had eclipsed 3 million or something of that nature. Um, how do you how do you come up with that, like that data? Like how do you know that it's this many cases are currently in the backlog of immigration court when we're also talking about cases that have been, say, administratively closed, are which are considered active cases, but they're closed, they're basically dormant for the time being, but they could be reinstated by either the prosecutor, ICE, or by the respondent or their counsel. How do you come up with that number or those numbers?
Yeah, so we're really looking at cases that are active. Not so it really is going to be any cases that are really sort of on the active docket. So you're absolutely right. There's cases that get terminated, so they were active and then they're officially closed. There's some that are basically put on the shelf, so to speak, like you mentioned, administratively closed. They can pull them off the shelf at any time. There's cases that are actively pending right now, and there's upcoming hearings. There's also cases that are open and they haven't been. There's no pending hearing. They haven't been what's called calendared yet. So anything that's active gets included with in that number, and that's pretty straightforward as far as that goes. But it is tricky because it is a good example of where sometimes the agency doesn't always agree or align with TRAC's approach or TRAC's methodology for what gets counted or not counted. So sometimes, I will often and have often gotten questions. Oh, why does the EOIR, why does the immigration court's number say this and your number says that? Typically, it's a subjective. Somebody's made the decision about how to do it. Yeah.
What numbers are we looking at right now as far as the backlog of immigration court cases, at least as of your last data points?
Yeah, so we're looking at 3.7 million right now, which is a ton of cases. So approaching 4 million. What we've seen in the past, let's say 2 years of the Biden administration, immigration judges have been working really hard, like they're clearing out a lot of cases, but it's just not nearly as much as the new cases coming in. So, for instance, in fiscal year 2024, which ended at the end of September, there were 1.7 million cases that were filed just in that year. Fiscal year 2023, we're looking at 1.4 million cases filed. In the year before that, there were almost 800,000 cases. So in those 3 years, more cases, I should probably do the math on this before I lean too hard into this, but just off the top of my head, I'm fairly confident about this. About as many cases were filed, new NTAs, notices to appear, were filed in those 3 years than the entire existence of the immigration court since it was created in the 80s. That's a lot
Uh,
of cases.
that is, yeah, that is a boatload. Do you also do any sort of like fiscal analysis of how much the government spends on this sort of enforcement, and so to demonstrate the waste that is going on?
Yeah, I've gotten that question a couple times. We haven't, mostly because the agency itself doesn't track it with the granularity that we would need, and we never really had. At least when I was at Track, we never really had the funding to go after like really detailed budget. Now, there are some really great organizations that have tried to estimate costs using, combining budget analysis with the kind of work that yeah, that Track has done, but I was
Is
never.
that like AIC, the Immigration
Yeah,
Council,
the
like
Immigration
Aaron
Council,
over there? Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Okay.
they've done some studies of like the cost of mass deportation. They recently merged with another organization, by the way, like 2 years ago, that was based out of New York. That was an economic institute. I am not an economist. I really respect the work of economists, but I'm not one. So I typically steer away from doing those kinds of economic driven analyses. I think they're fascinating, but you have to draw the line
It's
somewhere.
like when my clients ask me for tax advice.
Yeah,
I'm like,
yeah,
sorry, I am not going to be able to advise you on your ramifications of becoming a resident in the United States
yeah.
on your taxes. Um,
Only
so
one convoluted legal system at a time, right?
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's hard to keep a grasp of just one thing, let alone more than that. So let me ask you: are you still, like, in your role right now? Are you still working in conjunction with Track? Are you still involved with Track? Like, what's your position? What's your role currently at Syracuse?
Sure. So I'm in the in much more of a creative research position now. So I'm really taking the part of the work that I did at Track, which was always been really focused on immigration. By the way, Track does a whole bunch of other things too. They study the federal court, civil litigation, taxes. We study the IRS, all that stuff. So I've really focused and continue to focus on, which is my core research theme, which is immigration enforcement, politics, and polarization. I've really picked up the polarization piece because one of the things that I've noticed the most in the last couple of years is just how much immigration. I mean, when I started in this work in 2009, 2010, I'm sure you remember this, Mo. I mean, there wasn't New York Times headline articles about this. Nobody understood what a we're having debates online, Mo, about H-1B visas. Nobody had any idea what an
No,
H.
nobody has a clue. Yeah.
Nobody still has a clue. But
Nobody still does.
you know,
Well,
um,
and that's the fascinating thing about, like, I think when you and I got into doing the different areas of work we're in, I don't think that in a million years we would have thought that, like, we would be, suddenly doing work that's catching headlines all over the United States, right? Um, and uh, so when you were doing your dissertation and research, you said you went and actually were sitting in. Did you go to like removal hearings and proceedings and witness what goes on in there?
yeah, absolutely. I went to courts. I was in Charlotte Immigration Court shortly after it opened, Charlotte, North Carolina. So Charlotte. I spent a lot of time in Ohio, so Cleveland Immigration Court. So Atlanta, spent a lot of time in Atlanta, Chicago, Arlington, um, and a smattering of other courts. San Francisco. Um, so went all over the country, sitting in hearings, just spending the day there. Not just in the hearings too. I mean, I think what's really important for me to as a researcher, both in terms of what I'm interested in and also in terms of communicating to the public to help people understand, um, is these are real spaces that real people spend a lot of time. Now, a lot of there's a lot of remote hearings now, and COVID changed that. But before that, and still today, courtrooms, not just immigration court, but criminal courtroom, civil courtroom. Courtrooms are this really interesting, historically evolving, politicized social space that people spend a lot of time in. And it's not just about the courtroom. We can think about courtroom design. We can think about how courtroom design has evolved over the years, over the centuries. And if you go to any court in the country, you know that there's security. There are these social spaces where people are kind of milling about, having whispery conversations with their attorneys or just waiting for their hearing. There's kids running around. One of the things that I observed very early on was also it's a very multiracial space. So back to that like class thing that I was mentioning, one of the first people I ever interviewed was a woman whose husband was actually they were long-term partners. I don't think that they were legally married. That was part of the complication. But her long-term partner, he was Mexican. He was undocumented, effectively, and she was a white American, white, native-born American, whatever that means. And she was outraged. She was in her conversation with me, she was so furious about the fact that she's like, I live in this country. I was born here. Why can't I be with the person I want to be with? And this is taking place in the context of the waiting room of a immigration court, right? And so you see that, like, we think of we see the numbers. You think the numbers are just like they're just abstract numbers. You see this many people got asylum or this many people were deported. No, these it takes social spaces to make this system work. And when you go and you look at those spaces, what you see is a much more complicated picture of what the immigration system looks like. And we often think that it's like, well, immigration must be about immigrants. I often say this line. I've said it so many times it probably feels cliche at this point, but I study immigration. I don't study immigrants, because the idea of studying immigrants makes you think that immigration is just about people who aren't citizens. And the reality is that the immigration system is about all of us. It affects a lot of people who are not immigrants, but are just trying to have a family, run a business, have kids, be with a person that they love. And it affects so many more people. So that's sort of my pitch about why understanding the immigration court is so important. I'll just say one last thing here, which is a bit of a soapbox, but anybody listening who, if you're an immigration attorney, you've been to immigration court, if you're not and you've never been to an immigration court, go. They are public, technically. There are some minor restrictions, and it might feel a little intimidating at first, but there is nothing more. There will be no revelation you will ever find in some tweet or something you read online or some book that will come close to going and sitting in an immigration court for a morning. Just go do it.
So
It's the
true.
it's the
And
best education.
Doing field work like what you've done, how does that strengthen your ability to do the research that you do? Does it make it, I mean, maybe it doesn't, but does it make you stronger as a researcher because you are actually getting your hands dirty, so to speak? You're going into that forum.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to connecting data to real life, like so one of the things I often teach about is, so anytime you get data back from the government in any form, what you're getting is something that's several steps removed from reality. And if you don't understand what reality looks like, you're going to have a very hard time understanding the human decisions and the steps that went into creating the data. So, asylum or asylum's like is an example of, it's more, people understand asylum more commonly now, I suppose. So, we know that there's a lot of variation in grant rates and things like that. As you noted at the outset, some judges have very high denial rates, some judges have very high approval rates. And the reality is, if you've been in those courtrooms, it's very hard to understand how you might have gotten to those numbers if you haven't spent time in court. So it could be that judges just don't want to grant. And there are lots of judges that just don't want to grant. I've sat in those courtrooms, and doesn't matter how strong of a case, they'll find a way to undermine it. For a lot of judges who are trying to be responsible judges and hear cases out, there's all kinds of other things that can happen in the course of a case developing that might influence either the outcome of the case or the legitimacy of the case. So you actually said something at the top, which was, okay, if you're going into a courtroom with a judge with a very high denial rate, you are preparing to appeal.
You're
From
on
the,
guard. You're on
you're on,
guard from the get go, and you're gonna be really sensitive to that going in. Yeah,
right. And you're going to want to set a very, very clear record.
yeah,
One way of interpreting that, or one way of interpreting that from either a researcher or an attorney's perspective, is how legitimate is that decision? Is that judge's decision if they just deny 97, 99% of cases? Is that really, is it likely that the public, you and I included in the public, how likely is it that we're going to view that decision as actually an independent judicial decision formed through thoughtful sifting of facts and reality, as opposed to, this judge is just, this is not a serious judge when it comes to looking at the case, they're just going to deny. So the legitimacy of that decision might be called into question one way or another. When you're actually in the courtroom, though, you see, again, let's take judges who are really trying to, be judges. There's all kinds of issues. When you walk into that courtroom, I didn't even, it took me a while to recognize this. Those ICE attorneys sit there all day, every week with judges.
the same
They
judge a lot of times. Yeah,
often the same, they develop personal relationships, they know family members, they're able to like check in. That's a very different relationship than you have as an attorney popping in for a hearing. And now there's no data on that, there's no data point about that, but does that influence how the relationships that are at play in deciding a case? Absolutely. There's often little things. Mo, you've probably seen this too. Again, I didn't even recognize this for, took me 3 years before someone mentioned this to me. That ICE attorney sitting there, they, not only can they have their laptop with them, which you are not allowed to have, they plug their laptops, that Ethernet cord, right into the wall of the immigration court.
yep, yep,
They
yep.
are literally plugging into the court's resources to power their access to information. And you have to sit there laptopless and I've sat there in hearings, Mo, in asylum hearings, closed door asylum hearings. I actually watched a judge, a ICE attorney in Chicago one time. She was sitting there literally like Google translating articles from this individual's home country, trying to poke holes in their story. It wasn't preparatory research. It was on the fly, literally. Oh, you said this, and I just found this article. How legitimate is that? Like, you can't see that in the data, But to understand the data, you have to understand the texture of what these courtrooms look like.
Yeah. And by the way, we can bring laptops in now,
Oh, you
but
okay?
we still don't have like it's kind of still a bit of a different feel. You know what
Yeah,
I mean? Like and for years you would go in, they'd just be typing away, and you'd be like, okay, I'm sitting here still scribbling into a notebook and keeping
yeah,
notes. And I still do that. I mean, I don't know. I've gotten so used to it, but some of the younger attorneys that work with me, they're bringing in their Surface or their laptop into court. Now, I I think one thing you noted that's really important for the public to be aware of is, courts are usually supposed to be independent, or should be independent from political influence. Yeah, at least you would think so, but of course we know it's not. I mean, look at the Supreme Court, look at, what's going on all over the country, especially with the forum shopping on cases like what we saw with Judge Hainan down in Texas, and DACA and DAPA and everything. Um, the immigration court is under the Department of Justice. And what we see in our courts is that the attorney general can come in and totally influence the entire landscape of how we proceed in court and how the case, they can basically create precedent just out of thin air. And we've seen that time and again with Bill Barr, Jeff Sessions, even going back to, Janet Napolitano, so forth. And so there's been an outcry for immigration court to be created as an Article One independent court. Has your research or anything that you've touched been used to try and make these arguments? I assume so, but
yeah, yeah. It certainly has. I mean, there's a couple arguments for having an independent court system. I'm so glad you brought this up. I mean, there are some there are some really good arguments for it. Here's sort of the landscape right now. Um, the deciding factor from the perspective both of advocates and of Congress has been, will this improve efficiency? Okay, so let me just say, having worked with the data, looked at the data, been a part of these conversations, um, this is the argument that advocates for independent court tend to lean into. I don't think that there's anything super convincing about efficiency that matters whether it's independent or not. Unfortunately, that is the framework, and the problem with politics is always like you have to work within the frame that you are forced into. There are lots of other good reasons to have independent courts that the data does support, which is, things like, the ability for judges to decide, to manage their own dockets. Currently, the attorney general, and every administration does this, every administration screws up the immigration court scheduling system because everybody comes in with their priorities, and the president, through the attorney general, can say this is how you're going to organize your dockets from now. And you've probably seen this too. So what you have is, okay, you've got the court dockets set out for a certain amount of time. Everyone has their hearings. Well, then a new administration comes in and they say, okay, we're going to prioritize this. Well, what that means is these cases just get shuffled around a whole bunch. All of a sudden, you have to move these cases up, which means a whole bunch of hearings get canceled. You have to move a whole bunch of cases back. And it creates a lot of confusion. It creates issues for quality. It creates issues for representation. I know attorneys who have gone from, oh, I've got 10 asylum hearings over the next 10 months to I have 10 asylum hearings in the next month because everything got moved up because all of a sudden this is how they've decided to do it. And it's not just bad for immigrants and for individuals, it's bad for judges. I mean, they effectively can't control the flow of their own court. So it sounds like I'm making an argument for efficiency. I do think that there is some efficiency improvements that could be, offered by having an independent court. I also think that the real value of an independent court is probably more, in my mind, more about values, and about the question of whether or not our immigration court system is legitimate. It's more about legitimacy than efficiency. And I think this is a big question that it sounds theoretical, but it is actually worth asking, which is our immigration court system legitimate? Does the lack of independence, does the lack of fairness and consistency from judge to judge, from court to court, is it significant, or do all of these things add up to a legal system, to a court system? And judges wear robes. You're going into court. It looks like a court, sounds like a court, walks like a court. But is it legitimate? Is it a real court system that conforms to and corresponds to what we would consider an independent legal judicial system under whatever Western legal tradition means? I'm skeptical. I'm dubious, and I do think some independence some legitimate independence would be very useful in terms of improving fairness, improving due process, improving those things. Would it be more efficient? I don't know, but that's the argument.
Do you consider yourself, in your own opinion, an immigrant rights advocate or activist?
Um, I have been. I have, in the sense that I have advocated directly for policy change at the local level in my role as the sort of acting executive director of a nonprofit organization. I have spoken out publicly about the rights of immigrants and the importance of of due process and of immigrant rights. So I guess in that sense, I am. I have not. On the flip side, I've never advocated for deportation as a policy. I haven't advocated for the deportation of any individual. So I certainly could be seen in that way. I'll also say that my primary value and my primary focus is on understanding and public communication. And that always comes above everything else. So I have published research. I have publicly spoken about research. I've posted research online that doesn't neatly, correspond to the ideas or the values or the perceived, agendas of people who are more progressive or on the left and who would like to, who don't believe in deportation, who don't believe in borders. We can have that, the discussion about sort of political theory. So that's how it would situate itself.
You wrote an article you published about the CBP One app.
Yeah.
Um, were you aware, or did you know, or you probably, I'm sure you do, but maybe not in practice. I don't know if you've heard or seen what's happened, but since I think it was May of 2023, the Biden administration was making it mandatory for people who were crossing into the United States to use the CBP One app, and then weaponizing it against them in the immigration court when they didn't use that app. And for anyone who's listening, the CBP One app is an app that you can make an appointment with the Customs and Border Protection if you're a migrant, and assuming you have access to, number one, a smartphone, number two, the ability and knowledge of knowing how to use such an app, and number three, just even knowing that this exists, which is kind of a whole wild card in this situation because you're dealing with people a lot of times who are just crossing, through the desert in Mexico, and they're not going to be privy to this app. Your study that you wrote about talked about the glitches in the digitization of asylum and how the CBP One turned migrant smartphones into mobile borders. Talk a little bit about that study and what your findings were from that.
Yeah, this is there's a huge trend right now in the criminal justice system and the immigration enforcement system and in border controls globally to move from or include more and more complex technologies to facilitate immigration enforcement and border controls. So CBP One is sort of a symptom of a larger trend or an example of a much larger trend towards technology. What's interesting about CBP1 and unique about it is that it's part of a smaller but also growing trend to sort of capture migrants' smartphones. So traditionally, much of the technology along the border is like, okay, we have blimps, we have radar, we have cameras, we have motion detectors, we have all this stuff, and it's at a distance. It's trying to capture migrants' bodies and movement from a distance. The smartphone, as we all know, is very personal, it has personal photos or text messages, all this stuff. And governments have been as aware as any of it that device actually can be a much more effective and efficient tool for monitoring and capturing migrants' movements, whether surreptitiously through different technologies or through more overtly through something like the CBP1 app that's then required. So what was interesting to me is, so I think CBP1 and I think the whole idea behind CBP1 was that you could manage the border better if ports of entry had a little bit of timeline for scheduling people as opposed to people just showing up all at once. I actually think that's a very legitimate concern. I understand why immigrant rights advocates want to say, well, you should accept as many asylum seekers as present themselves on any given day. And legally, that is true. Logistically, I understand why that is not. Just practically speaking, if you're running a coffee shop and you go from 100 customers in the morning to 2,000 customers in the morning, it's not the same. Okay, so it's just not. So I actually think I don't necessarily think that the idea behind it was in itself wrong. What I or misplaced. The problem that I sort of had with it as I looked into it and watched the rollout was they essentially took really sloppy, untested technology and tested it out on the most vulnerable population you could imagine, which is asylum seekers. That's crazy. You might want to test out a technology if you go to the hospital and you have a heart condition, and you might be interested, if there's no other option, to get enrolled in a technology that's untested or marginally tested. You might say, well, either I die or I could try this thing that maybe it'll work. That might be okay. If you went into the hospital and you had a heart condition and you learned that everybody with a heart condition is getting this experimental technology that nobody knows is going to work, you would be outraged at the hospital because that's an absurd population to try out untested technology on. And that's what the agency did. So that's really what I had a problem with. And what was that, and the fact that they kept sort of wrapping CBP1 in this wrapping paper of, oh, this is efficient, this is technology, this is going to make everything better. And it was a bit of a farce. It was sort of it was a bit of a bait and switch. It
It was
wasn't
like the beta test. The beta test was on the migrants.
the
There
beta
was
test was on
no,
the
yeah.
migrants. Yeah.
And what I noted earlier is that the Biden administration created this policy where if you don't use it and you're seeking asylum, you could be barred from getting asylum unless you can show one of a few limited exceptions. So, for example, you were fleeing imminent danger, or somebody was very ill that was traveling with you, or you had a family unit. I mean, those are some of the minor exceptions, but it's become a problem with a lot of my asylum cases right now because the judges are saying, "Oh, well, or ICE raises the fact that the person didn't use the app; they were just found in the desert, or they, approached a border patrol agent and said, 'I want asylum,' and because they didn't follow that proper protocol, that's become an impediment, and I don't see that getting fixed anytime soon. I see it get worse. um, and so, like your publications that you have, are most of them? I mean, I know if people want to read them, they can find them through your own personal Syracuse University Newhouse page online, and there's links to your publications. Is that correct?
Mhm. Yeah, there's links there for publications. I have a website with that have PDFs if they're available. If you can't find the PDF, you can always email me. But my website is austinkocher.com. I also I write a lot on Substack these days, which I know that's a little cliche, but it's actually been a really good way for me to take the work that I'm doing and to sort of rewrite it and reframe it in a way that's more accessible to people. So that's been really fun to do. That's probably a sometimes a better way to keep up to date with the research. I can get things out so much faster there because I'm not going through peer review. Um, so that's another good way to stay in touch about the
And the
work.
projects that you're working on, does that include? Have you looked into, or have you worked on, or been working on any books? I mean, we live in probably one of the most fascinating times in the history of the United States, in bad and good. You know, there's just so much going on. It's insane right now. And, you know, being in the position, you know, the forefront of this issue, the immigration issue and everything else, what are you doing? Are you working on some book or projects?
Yeah, I am working on the book proposal right now. I can't say anything about it just yet. We'll wait
Okay,
till
cool.
I can go public. But yeah, the projects I'm really focused on right now, definitely understanding deportation politics during the Trump administration. That's going to continue to just dramatically shape our institutions. Whether you agree or disagree with the Trump administration, it will dramatically transform our immigration institutions. I'm also uniquely focused on the technology angle. So both CBP1 technology at the border, as well as electronic monitoring throughout the country that migrants are on. And then a sort of a bigger theoretical project that's newer in my new role is really focused on polarization. How do we talk about immigration in a way that is factual and defensible and doesn't overlook differences of perspective and opinion, but doesn't get sort of mired in disinformation and misinformation and sort of antagonisms that aren't particularly helpful.
With all the disinformation that is out there, you know, I mentioned earlier Aaron Melnick Reichlin from the American Immigration Council. Um, I would imagine that's somebody that you follow and, you know, track through social media. Who else would you recommend people follow for the right information when it comes to anything on immigration? Are there specific people that you, or organizations that you tend to be following as your go-to?
Sure. I mean, I think any of the organizations that are sort of where you've got immigration attorneys and immigration policy experts at the top of it, whether one agrees or disagrees necessarily with the position or anything. So, I mean, the Migration Policy Institute (MPI) is a great one. I think the Cato Institute, again, if you're more libertarian minded, which is more of a classical Republican position, I think they do really good work on immigration. The Niskanen Center does good work. Immigration Lab, I have an affiliation, so this is a little selfish, but the Immigration Lab at American University here in DC, Ernesto does just fantastic work. Michael Parlberg from VCU, Virginia Commonwealth University, also does really some fantastic work on policy throughout Latin America. I would also suggest WOLA. Adam Isaacson at WOLA does WOLA, the Washington Office on Latin America, does incredible work. And I think one of the themes that I tend to look for, and if anyone's interested, is look for people who really have policy or legal expertise and look for voices that don't just focus on the United States. Because one thing we forget about in the misinformation economy is one of the biggest drivers of misinformation is I'm a geographer. So here's the is we get geographically narrow, so we're unable to recognize misinformation because so much of it is tied to conditions in sending countries. So one of the best ways is to help fix misinformation and disinformation is to remember that immigration is a hemispheric and a globalist issue. So look for voices that are not just in the United States. I mean, Aaron and I are very American centric, right? I mean, we understand, but we're pretty American centric. Adam Isaacson, very Latin American focused. Michael Parlberg, very focused on Latin America. voices like that are just really, really important to include.
Yeah, and look at the root causes, like what's causing, like all of a sudden, I started seeing Cameroonians show up in my office in 2016. I was like, what the hell's going on here? Why are all these people from Cameroon showing up here? Well, I looked it up. Sure enough, there's a lot of problems going on in Cameroon between the Anglophones and the Francophones, and it's pushing the English speakers to flee. And I think, like you say, if people don't look more globally, they're not going to fully understand what is causing this push, the push and pull that goes on with immigration and migration around the world, whether it be, civil war, civil strife, you know, the climate, um, you know, governments coming in and causing problems, And so those are great. And I will also make a pitch for David Beer and the folks over at Cato, even if you're not a libertarian, their information, their data, their research is amazing. And I had the opportunity to interview David about a month ago, and it's really quite insightful when you talk to people like yourself and David, and people are experts on these issues. Um, so just moving away real quick before we close up. So outside of your work and research, like what else do you like to do? Like, just what sort of interests do you have beyond just sitting in front of a computer or going out and doing field work?
Well, I'm a runner, so I love to run. That's a big de-stressor for me. I love running and hiking. I like film and literature. Honestly, like if I could have made a living as reading and talking about literature, I probably would have. I'm watching and reading through some classic Russian filmmakers. So Tarkovsky, there's a Russian filmmaker, Andrei Tarkovsky, for instance, who he's made some films in Russia and then made a couple in the United States. Very quirky, mid-century, 60s, 70s kinds of stuff. And so I'm watching through his sort of oeuvre of film, and I love classic film, and I love international film, and big fan of literature. I'm just rereading Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, for instance. Great 20th century novel of carnage and violence, but beautifully written.
For running, do you do distance or more just for pleasure? Like, do you run marathons? Do you like trail running? What's your go-to
Yeah,
there?
I haven't done a race in a long time. I really liked half marathons for a while. I've never done a marathon. I've actually never been interested in a marathon because although some people can do it and do it pretty well, it can be really hard on the
Takes its
body.
toll. Takes its toll.
Yeah,
Take
and
it from me, I did
oh,
it.
you did. Oh,
Yeah, it was.
what
I
was the
did.
recovery like?
Oh, it actually, once you get into that like cycle,
Distance?
recovery was not that difficult.
Okay.
But
Okay.
if you don't keep going with it,
Yeah.
it's just like any sort of,
Yeah.
machine, you just lose that ability. And so for like a couple of years, I was like gung ho about it, but it really, I mean, it will take its toll, but not only so much on the recovery, it's like planning and
Mhm.
having to be getting up, super early, for example, especially if you live where I am in Arizona and it's so
Oh,
hot, you got to be out doing, if you have to do 15, 20 miles, that's,
yeah. You got to get up early for
get
that.
up super early. So
Yeah.
yeah, it was a good experience, but I don't think I'm going to go back to to that.
Yeah.
Um, are you a Ohio State football fan, or what's your? Do you not follow the sports
You
over
know,
there?
I've never really been a huge sports follower, but it's funny, because you spend a couple of years at OSU, and I never thought I'd get into it, and then
It
I
sucked
got
you in.
yeah, it sort of sucks you in, and then when you move away, like it becomes like this weird connection point, which
Yeah,
it's not a very strong one for me, but with the playoffs this year, it's been interesting to see how the playout, so just OSU losing to Michigan 4 years in a row. Again, I don't get that emotionally into it, but it's like disappointing. But then to watch them, knock off Oregon,
Yeah.
the other day was pretty fun. So I get into it enough to feel like I can rep a little bit.
Yeah, it was fun. I went to Syracuse for
Yeah.
undergrad, and back then Marshall Street was very like it was bar, bar, bar. Now it's more like there's a Starbucks, there's a Jimmy John's, there's not
Yeah.
really, or a Jersey Mike's, I think it is, or maybe
Jersey.
it's a
Yeah.
Jimmy, but like all these bars are gone, and all that's left is basically like Fagan's, and it's kind of depressing when I went back there. I was like, it used to be such a wild, bustling party scene, and then
Yeah.
I go back and I'm like, what's going on over here?
What years were you there?
I was there 92 to 96,
Okay.
so
Okay. Yeah.
it
Yeah.
was like
Have you been back in recent years?
I did, and I saw so I saw Newhouse 2, the second
Yeah. Yeah.
building that they had built there. I Gosh, it was crazy, like walking over by where the dome is on the opposite side where the School of Forestry, I think
Hmm.
it is over there. That has grown immensely. Like
Hmm.
that, the campus is definitely, just like most campuses, has changed considerably, and so many new buildings and infrastructure. And I got to see one of my favorite professors. I actually met her. I randomly emailed her and said, "Hey, you might remember me from like 30 years ago." And I'm like, she probably doesn't, but she did. And it was Sharon Hollenbach. I don't know if you ever met her,
Okay.
who worked in like film. She was at Newhouse, and she had
Hmm.
just retired. And so I went out and had brunch with her with my son. And
That's
it was
nice.
awesome. Yeah.
That's
So,
incredible.
but yeah. So, anything else you want to pitch, promote? I will also set up a link to your website and the data so people can access that publications. Um, Anything else you want to note?
Yeah,
Do we have?
I'll tell you what. Here's one thing that I think it's so important right now. We are going to enter 4 years of just chaos, and if the thing that I'm sensing from so many people, including myself, is like you really focus on what you can actually do, because we will burn ourselves out. We will kill ourselves over trying to keep up with every single thing. And I just think it's more important than ever that people just like, you got to be in it for the long haul. This is the world we live in right now. It's really difficult. It's really unfortunate. You got to make the difference that you can make, but we got to find ways to peel ourselves away from all of the like the social media, from all of the arguments, from all of that. We've got to peel ourselves away and do something healthy. So like just settle in. Like it's a marathon, it's not a sprint.
It is. And you are on, is Blue Sky the best place to follow you and, see
Yeah.
your, commentary on there?
Yeah, I'm on all the platforms, but I think Blue Sky has emerged as the one I'm most comfortable saying,
Mhm.
like, go there. It's
Sure.
a good place. It's a good place.
And it's Austin Kocher, Kocher.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm. That's right.
and well, thank you. I really appreciate you joining me.
Likewise.
And again, this is Immigration Ain't Easy. My daughter Emma, I always got to give her a shout out because she will slave away at editing this.
Hmm.
Which actually, I don't think she'll have to do much editing on this one. We were very well behaved.
Nice.
So are our Wi-Fi computers, whatever. But thank you, Austin.
Yeah.
I appreciate you joining me, and I look forward to talking to you more in the future, and maybe even having you back on sometime in the next couple of years where we can circle back and see where things stand.
Yeah, I'd like that. Thanks so much for having me on, Mo. This is a tremendous service to the community to have this out there. Yeah.
Thanks, brother.